This intelligence did not reach Napoleon until the night between the 26th and the 27th. It changed all his plans in the course of a few hours. In the morning of the 27th, he made a precipitate march for Troyes, and the Prussian army, followed by R.C. Sir Aube and Cézanne. He left only 2 corps d'armée before Troyes, that of the Duc de Reggio and of the Duc de Tarente. The Duc de Tarente was the commander-in-chief. At the moment when these 2 generals were left to themselves, the former engaged in very hot action on the heights of the Barcer Alp, and the latter began his march in the direction of Châtillon, but the pursuit of the Austrians was no longer thought of. The troops that remained opposed to those of Schwarzenberg were to limit the efforts to the keeping them in check, and above all to mask the grand movement which our army was making on Blucher. With that view, the Duc de Reggio and General Gerard, who were engaged with the enemy, caused the acclamation which commonly signalized the arrival of Napoleon to be raised along the line. These shouts were heard by the opposite line, and while Napoleon was retiring by forced marches from Troyes, Schwarzenberg believed that he had just joined his army. On the 27th of February, about noon, Napoleon arrived at R.C. Sir Aube. He stopped a few hours at the seat of Monsieur de la Brief, his chamberlain, for the purpose of giving the troops time to defile and pass the Aube. In leaving the bridge at R.C., the army turned to the left and followed the cross route leading to Cézanne. At night, it bivouacked on the confines of the departments of the Aube and Marne, and not far from La Fère-Champenoise. Napoleon passed the night in the house of the curate of the little village of Her. Let us stop there for a moment with the imperial headquarters. After the fatigues of the day, general gaiety still shed occasional light on the gloom of the moment. This evening party at Urbis is perhaps the last of the kind which I shall have occasion to notice. This parsonage consisted of a single apartment and a bakehouse. Napoleon shut himself up in the apartment and shortened the night by his customary labors. The bakehouse was instantly filled with the marshals, the generals that were aides-de-camp, the orderly officers, and the other officers of the household. The curate was desirous of doing the honors of his establishment, and in the midst of so many embarrassments, he had the misfortune to engage in a Latin dispute with Marshal Lefebvre. During this time, the officers got round his niece, who entertained them with singing canticles. The mule belonging to the canteen was long expected, but at length arrived. A door was immediately placed upon a hogshead, and some planks were fixed round it in the form of benches. They were occupied by the principal officers, and the others helped themselves standing. The curate was seated to the right of the grand marshal, and we entered into conversation respecting the country in which we were. It was with difficulty that our host comprehended how his military guests could be so well acquainted with its localities, and insisted upon our all being natives of Champagne. In order to explain the cause of his astonishment, we showed him some sheets of Cassini, which were in everyone's pocket. He was still more astonished when he found in them the names of all the neighboring villages. So far was he from thinking that geography entered into such details. It was then that the simplicity of the good curate enlivened the end of the repast. Shortly afterwards, everyone shifted for himself in the adjacent barns. The officers on service alone remained near Napoleon's apartment. Their truss of straw was brought to them, and the curate, being deprived of his bed, the place of honor on the camp bed, was given up to him. The next morning, the 28th, the imperial headquarters set off at a very early hour. Napoleon was on horseback, while the curate was still asleep. He at length awoke, but to console him for not having taken leave, he was presented by order of the Grand Marshal with a purse, the usual compensation given in all houses of an inferior class where Napoleon stopped. We shall now bid adieu to the good curate of Urbis and follow the movements of the army. While the army continued its march towards Cézanne, Napoleon attacked with some light troops a corps of the enemy, which had passed the night near our bivouacs at La Fère-Champenoise, and drove it before him. It was a detachment of cavalry which Blucher had thrown on that side under the command of General Tettenborn, for the purpose of keeping up his communication with the Austrian army and obtaining intelligence of our march. The columns of the French army effected a junction about the middle of the day at Cézanne. They halted there merely to gain information. It was ascertained that the Dukes de Treviso and Ragusa had joined each other on the 26th at La Ferté-sous-Jouarre, but that being too weak. Notwithstanding their junction, they had continued to fall back before Blucher's forces and was then be at Meaux, and that in order to preserve that suburb of the capital. There was not a moment to be lost. The army immediately resumed its march, but the day being already very far advanced, it was impossible to push forward more than a few leagues beyond Cézanne, and it bivouacked halfway to La Ferté-Gaucher, the imperial headquarters, passed the night at the castle of Estrenay, which had been pillaged by the Prussians in the morning. Several early officers, dispatched in the greatest haste by the two marshals who had been just left beyond choice, arrived in the evening and were the bearers of bad news. The Austrians were no longer falling back. They had resumed defensive operations with great spirit at the very instant Napoleon left Troyes, the action which the troops of the Duc de Reggio and General Gerard had to sustain on the 27th on the heights of Bar-sur-Aube was sanguinary. The enemy's generals were prodigal in the number of troops they employed in the attack, and the personal valor of the commanders-in-chief spared no efforts to revive the confidence of that discouraged army and to prevail on it to overwhelm in mass the small number of French opposed to it. Wittgenstein and Schwarzenberg himself were wounded. The reinforcements which every instant joined the enemy rendered the contest more and more disproportionate, and at night the French generals determined to retreat. They fell back upon Troyes. The Duke of Tarento, who had gained some advantage on the side of Moussi-l'Evêque, and had even for a moment relieved the Austrians in the guard of honor attending the Congress of Châtillon, was carried along in the retreat, which brought back the Duke of Reggio to Troyes. The Austrians were then aware that the troops opposed to them were but a screen, and that the main body of the French army had followed Napoleon. They were themselves so confident in their numbers that they hesitated no longer to detach Generals Hesse, Homberg, and Bianchi against the Duke de Castiglione, who was becoming too dangerous in their rear. Thus, a few days were sufficient to destroy our advantages and to baffle our projects. The Austrians, whom we thought to pursue as far as the Rhine, rallied between Langres and Bar, and then resumed their march against us. Marshal Augereau was no longer able to operate the diversion which had been planned upon the Saône, and Paris was more than ever threatened by Blucher's army, which was at the gates of Meaux. Napoleon still hoped, by the influence of his activity, to restore his good fortune. He determined in the first place to dispose of Blucher, and next relied upon returning on the Seine time enough to preserve Troy. On the 1st of March, the French army arrived at an early hour at Ferté-Gaucher. Napoleon stopped a moment at the house of the mayor, a very old man, who had grown young again with zeal, and whom Napoleon made still younger by conferring on him the decoration of the Legion of Honor. The intelligence from Meaux was encouraging. The Prussians were stopped by the breaking down of the bridges of Tréport and Lagny. They were also stopped on the preceding day, the 28th, on the line of Orsay at the village of Lizy by the troops of the Duc de Ragusa, and on the Terouenne at the ford of Tremy by the troops of the Duc de Treviso. Thus the two marshals still maintained themselves in front of Meaux. Napoleon expected, no doubt, to arrive in time. In the course of a few hours, his troops would be drawn up in line. Should Blucher make head against them, it was probable that a decisive battle would take place and that affairs might be promptly reestablished. Filled with these hopes, the army continued with all possible expedition in march by Rebais. It was harassed with fatigue, but sustained with the ardent hope of victory. It directed its movements from Rebais to La Ferté. Arrived at length on the heights of Jouarre, discovered at its feet the town of La Ferté, the windings of the valley, and on the other side of the Marne, the Prussian army, which had escaped its pursuit. Marshal Blucher had no doubt been informed of the approach of Napoleon by Tettenborn's light troops. He had immediately evacuated the left side of the Marne, effected a junction with those on the right, cut down the bridges, and had just placed the river between us. Napoleon ordered a bridge to be constructed with all possible expedition at La Ferté, but 4 and 24 hours at least were required for that operation. The night was passed at Jouarre. The following day, the 2nd of March, Napoleon went to La Ferté to superintend the construction of the bridge and took up his residence in the first house in the Faubourg of Paris. The plain extending between the Marne and the Ourcq was covered with detachments of the Prussian army, which were observed to take advantage of the time we lost in reestablishing the bridge and to retreat in disorder in the direction of Soissons. The weather was horrible, and the only passage left for them was through the crossways where the equipages remained in the mud. The remembrance of Montmirail and Vauchamp seemed to revive and spread confusion among them. Accounts of the enemy's embarrassment and terror were every instant brought to La Ferté by the peasants who escaped from them. These accounts served but to increase Napoleon's impatience across the Marne. Barclay d'Albe was dispatched to Paris with intelligence of the retreat of the Prussians. Rumigny, one of the secretaries of the cabinet, was sent as a courier to Châtillon to acquaint the Duc de Vicenza with the state of affairs. Aides de camp were dispatched to the Dukes de Treviso and Belluno, with orders for them to resume offensive operations and to form the left of the circle, within which Blucher was about to be enclosed in the night between the 2nd and 3rd of March. Our troops finally effected the long-delayed passage of the Marne. But the weather changed on a sudden. The rain was succeeded by a hard frost and the muddy ways, out of which the enemy's troops extricated themselves with difficulty, but a few hours before were converted into solid and easy roads.